Hello, Leadership 201, and welcome to our online lecture series. Today, we're going to go over our third video in the lecture series on servant leadership. So, one thing about servant leadership that I like to preface most of my lecture on is the fact that servant leadership in itself is really a supplemental theory in the sense that it's not really this whole entire theory like we would typically see in things we've talked about in the past, like Path Goal or LMX, but really it's a supplement that can be utilized with various theories out there in a leadership context. So let's go ahead and get started and talk a little about what servant leadership means. So many of you have probably heard the term servant leadership. It's a very, what I like to call, sexy phrase right now in the leadership industry. Everybody wants to be a servant leader. There's a lot of work out there in terms of writings and in books like Leaders Eat Last. One of my favorites by Simon Sinek talks a lot about servant leadership and serving others. So today we're going to go over kind of what servant leadership truly means, talk about some of the historical basis of how it started, and really talk about something which Greenleaf, who is the forefather of servant leadership, defined as the 10 characteristics of servant leadership. And then from there, we'll kind of give some more in-depth look at how it's evolving right now and some of the strengths and criticisms of servant leadership in itself. So, first and foremost, servant leadership is what we like to call a paradox in the sense that it's both a service and an influence on the followers. So, this leader itself is being a servant, providing a service to the followers, but also providing influence over them. So, it does work in tandem, like a typical leadership theory that we would see. So, basically, most of the scholarship in the leadership world has been very prescriptive, as we've talked about in the past. Um, and the sense around servant leadership is no different. So a lot of the things that we've talked about in the ideas of servant leadership has been very prescriptive. So kind of doing this will get you this type of outcome. And over the past 10 years, really, servant leadership has come onto the scene. So it's very young, very new in terms of being a theory. And really, servant leadership itself focuses on leadership from the point of view of the leader and his behavior. So it's a very behavioralistic type of theory. And ultimately, the goal of servant leadership is that the leader is putting the followers first and the needs of the followers first. So, servant leadership, like I said, was first coined by a gentleman by the name of Robert Greenleaf. And some of you may have heard his famous work called Servant Leadership. He also has an institute out there, the Greenleaf Service Leadership Institute as well. So Greenleaf said in his initial definition that servant leadership begins with the natural feeling that one wants to serve first. Then conscious choice brings one to aspire to lead. The difference manifests itself in the care taken by the servant, first to make sure that other people's highest priority needs are being served. Um, the best test really is to ask yourself, do those served grow as people? Do they, while being served, become healthier, wiser, freer, more autonomous, and more likely themselves to become a servant? So really what Greenleaf's trying to say there is that somebody who is aspiring to lead really needs to take the time to see if the priorities of their people are being met. And as a leader in that leadership process, is the leader making sure that their followers are becoming healthier, wiser, freer, and so on, while being served by the leader. So a lot of the times, like I said in a couple seconds ago, servant leadership is kind of described as a trait, but really for our intents and purposes here in the chapter, we're going to focus really on as a behavior. So like I was saying, Robert Greenleaf and Robert Greenleaf Center for Servant Leadership really started advocating for building these consensus in groups rather than using the idea of coercive leadership. So being a servant to the followers instead of actually, using coercion, using the power that you have as a leader to get someone to do something. So Robert Greenleaf was inspired by a work called Journey to the East, pretty classic work where basically along the lines, the travelers in this story understand that the true leader of the group was the one that served, was their servant, actually. So a pretty interesting work, a very long one, I will say, but a great read to kind of understand some of the really early historical contexts of leaders, and really kind of seeing how servant leadership came to fruition. And, kind of a caveat here, some of the really early ideals of servant leadership were found around the teachings of Jesus Christ in, the Christian Bible, really seeing, how Jesus was a servant to his followers. So that's kind of some of the other really inspiration for some of the initial works on servant leadership, even prior to Greenleaf's time. But really, leaders have a social responsibility for what we call these have-nots. So leaders really give the steering wheel to the followers, but act there as that resource and making sure that the kind of the boundaries are being tested at all times, and that the followers really have control of the outcome in the sense that the leader is there to do whatever it takes to get them to achieve the goals and help develop them more as a person and not so much around the task. So it's really important to kind of note in servant leadership that this is a very follower focused type of leadership, in the sense that it's more about creating that behavioral change, really providing that impact onto the followers and not so much that process which the followers are engaging in. So, in the work of a gentleman by the name of Spears, back in the early 2000s, he really parsed out some of the initial work that Greenleaf did into these 10 key characteristics of servant leadership. And this is really where we're going to base most of our lecture around today, just because these are kind of the foremost authority on a lot of the key characteristics of servant leadership. So, the first one of the characteristics that really is talked about and saying that every servant leader really needs to possess this is that listening is very important. So acknowledging that the viewpoint of the followers, acknowledging their viewpoint and also validating their perspectives is really important. So it's important for the leader to engage with in dialogue with their followers and understand, where they're coming from on the front lines of being a follower. Another one is empathy. The biggest characteristic of servant leadership is really standing in the shoes of your followers and attempting to really see the world from that person's point of view. And a lot of great servant leaders really get on the ground and do the jobs of their followers so they can have empathy for that person, where they're at in the role, and have a better understanding of how, as a leader, the decisions they make impact that person from their own point of view. So another one of the characteristics is healing. And not so much in the sense that we're being medical professionals here as leaders, but really it's in helping followers become what we call whole. So making somebody whole again, whether if somebody has been wronged, um, or anything like that, it's really important to make sure that, as a leader, we find those pieces that are missing in our followers and help build them back up to become the whole person that they are. And one of the things that Greenleaf and Spears both says is, the servant leaders are themselves healed in helping others. So kind of having that satisfaction of making an impact on somebody is really important. Another one, number 4, is awareness. So understanding oneself and the impact that they have on others. So it's really important for a servant leader to be very socially aware and emotionally aware of how their decisions impact others. A good servant leader really is in touch with that and is constantly taking the pulse of what they're doing and how their actions actually do have an impact on the people that they serve. So another one is persuasion. So a good servant leader really creates change through gentle, non-judgmental argument. So argument being in the sense it's really the dialogue. It's a two-way street, going back and forth to get the best outcome. And a good servant leader is not being really testy and pushing of trying to get the outcome from their followers, but instead really utilizes, like we had talked about earlier, is a dialogue to, understand first of all where somebody is coming from, then also kind of expressing their needs to get the best possible outcome. Another thing that servant leaders are really good at doing is being a conceptualizer. So having the ability to be that visionary, kind of seeing forward, someone that's always 2 steps ahead in their mind, getting ready to really make sure that they're able to set themselves up for success and ultimately set their followers up for success, to achieve the overarching goals of the organization. So this person is very futuristic, which kind of leads to the next thing, is foresight, which they have the ability to really predict what is coming based on what has occurred in the past and what's occurring in the present. So these people are very analytical. They're very able to predict, how they can change things, adapt things to get the best possible outcome in the future. So they're very in touch with not only their followers, but the pulse of the organization, some of those environmental factors that reside there as well. The last 3 of the characteristics of servant leadership, the first one being stewardship. So carefully managing their people and the organization that you've been given. So, a good servant leader is really the steward of the organization and the steward of that organizational culture that we talk a lot about in organizational behavior contexts. And really, this good servant leader is holding the organization for the greater good of society. So making sure that they're leveraging the assets and the people that they have in the organization to do the greatest good for humanity as a whole. To build off of that too, really a commitment to the growth of people and ultimately the growth of the followers is very important for servant leaders. So treating each follower as a unique person with a value beyond what they actually contribute to the organization is very unique. A lot of the things that we discuss in leadership is just kind of talking about the follower inside the organization. But a good servant leader takes that and goes one step further to understand some of the other factors that make that person who they are. So really investing themselves into their people, understanding, what their people do, why they think that way, maybe what are some of the things that make up their social location, their positionality, um, how they bring those into the organization and utilize and leverage their strengths and their weaknesses to be a unique citizen in the organization and the greater context of humanity as well. And the last one, and a very important one of servant leadership, is building community. So making somebody feel a part of something greater than themselves. And all three of these really tie into this larger context of what we talked about, organizational culture. Culture is very important. And, making somebody feel like they're a part of something, a part of that group, a part of the in-group of the organization is very important. And a lot of you can probably resonate with the fact of a time where you've either worked for a company or had a really good leader that's made you feel like you were a part of something greater. It sucks to kind of feel like you're a number in a lot of senses, but really having a good leader that is committed to understanding who you are, it helps you welcome you into the organization and make you a part of that community to where you're not really feeling like you're being led by somebody, but your really opinions are valued and you as a person are truly valued in the organization is what makes servant leadership really great. So we've seen a lot of growth in recent years in terms of servant leadership, and it's a very new theory in the sense there's a lot of work still being done on that. So Greenleaf's initial leadership approach really loosely defined these characteristics and these principles, like the 10 we just talked about. And servant leadership has really been utilized in recent times as a guiding philosophy in many different types of organizations, especially in the business context, and a lot of things like religious groups and nonprofits really take a heavy emphasis on being servant leaders to the world and to their followers. And a lot of really recent models have been developed as early as even 2017 here. So you can kind of see, and I'll show you here in just a second, how some of these traits have kind of evolved and come to fruition over time. So your textbook does a pretty good job of showing some of these theories. So this is actually right from your textbook, and we can see as early as 1999, some people really started to parse out some of Robert Greenleaf's work. So for example, we have Lobb in 99, who starts talking about things like sharing leadership and displaying authenticity, like our past lecture on authentic leadership. Some other really, great things that we look at is, like for example, in 2006, emotional healing, persuasive mapping, organizational stewardship. So we see some different phrases here that all really do kind of have a high relation to the work of Greenleaf, but you really kind of take on their own spin and place different importance on different things. So some of the more recent things that we see is like in 2011, where we see things like humility, standing back, giving somebody else the control of the wheel. But we really see a lot of these key characteristics like authenticity and being really relationship oriented. So you can take a look at that chart there and really see for yourself some of the different things that we've talked about. And all of these are very important in servant leadership, and none are really better than the other in my personal opinion. But you can see just how important that servant leadership is in recent years, just because of all this great work that has been done on it. So kind of simmering all of that down and really talking about all of this great thing of servant leadership into more of a model now. So we have these three different factors. We have the antecedent conditions. So what happens before servant leadership? Then we have servant leadership behaviors. So what is servant leadership in itself? And then we have these outcomes. So let's first really talk about the antecedent conditions. So our context and our culture is very important. What are we doing as an organization to foster the ideas of servant leadership? What type of attributes do we as leaders really possess to be able to make this happen? And also, are our followers set up to be prepared to receive servant leadership? Are they willing to be having that heavy relationship focus and not so much a focus on the task and the process? Another thing too in servant leader behaviors, now we look there, this list is not inclusive by any means, as we just saw that really, really long list before, and also the 10 that Robert Greenleaf initially proposed. So we see things, conceptualizing, emotional healing, ethical behavior, empowerment, creating value for the community. All of these are very important in servant leadership behaviors. So what this model is saying is if the antecedent conditions are right and a leader is in place to display this type of behavior, we have some really good outcomes. Things like follower performance and growth. So really developing your followers to become the next leaders of the organization. Not only that too, but good organizational performance. So going an extra mile to really, do the best and achieve the organizational outcomes, whether that's an increase in productivity or profit, or just spreading the work, doing more good in the organization. um, and most importantly, one of my personal favorite things in servant leadership is that societal impact. So I remember we talked in the past about my really large passion around corporate social responsibility. And a lot of that comes from the ideas of servant leadership. Because through having good servant leaders who not only want to serve the organization and its people, there's a greater good from that, creating a societal impact through doing these great things in servant leadership. And I'm really unfortunately not going to be able to give you my full lecture on corporate social responsibility this year, but it's a really great process and a really great example of how servant leadership in organizations can come to fruition and really make a difference on a larger setting, not so much even in the organization, but humanity as a whole. So just to kind of recap there and show, like, again, the really Leiden's model in 2008, like I said, were those antecedent conditions. So context and culture, we have the org context and also those dimensions of culture. So things like power distance we've talked about. We have leader attributes, so those traits and behaviors that the leaders possess, like emotional intelligence and agreeableness. And we have those follower receptivity. So do we have followers that basically want to work with servant leaders, and do they desire it, and has servant leadership had a positive impact on their performance? And so Leiden's model includes 7 things. So this is not always the case. My personal belief is Leiden's model can be extended to hundreds of different behaviors. But conceptualizing, so one of the first ones, really a thorough understanding of the organization. And Leiden used an example in a textbook as well, of a senior nursing supervisor in an emergency room. So somebody has a really good understanding of the organization as a whole. The next one, emotional healing. So really recognizing other people's problems and taking the time to address them one-on-one, to really make the best impact. Also putting followers first. So somebody that really just values their followers and those relationships and making sure they're the best person possible, is very important. And we keep going on this list here, helping followers grow and succeed. So really knowing people's professional and personal goals, behaving ethically. So, doing the right thing in the right way, even when nobody's looking. That's very important. And we'll talk about ethics actually in the next lecture that we have about why ethics are so important. And empowerment. So, allowing the followers to really be independent, make their own decisions, and be self-sufficient, and, have their own liberty and put their own kind of personal spice on it, per se, to be themselves and be individuals is really important. And so, like last we were saying, creating value for the community is very important. So giving back, intentionally giving back is important. Not just giving back to make a gain, but really encouraging followers to be a good servant themselves. So everybody has followers in their lives, maybe even in informal context, and really encouraging everybody to really volunteer and give their time to ultimately better humanity is very important. And just to kind of break that down here some more, so it really kind of shows, like I said, first get you those really high performances and followers, and their growth. So really making them those servant leaders and having high in performance, org performance. So there is a really large correlation between servant leadership and what we call organizational citizenship behaviors. Additionally, team effectiveness can also be increased by increasing members' shared confidence that they can be effective. So really, having a good servant leader is able to show that a team environment is very effective. And that ultimately helps if you're trying to integrate teams into an organization. It's a very great thing. And also societal impact. So some of the examples, things like we think about Mother Teresa, and kind of some of the charity work there. Also, companies like Southwest Airlines are very large servant leaders in the industry. You can think about some of the great things that they do as well. So really, how does servant leadership work? And like I said at the beginning of the lecture, it's very different from many other leadership theories. It's really concerned with putting followers first, and the outcomes are likely to emerge because of that. And this works really well in tandem with other leadership theories. And it also works best when leaders are really altruistic and have a strong motivation to do good and help others do good. So, one really important thing about this, though, like we were saying, is it's important for followers to be receptive of this leadership style, because without it, it's really not going to have the largest impact that it possibly could to create community or societal change. So, this is a really great leadership theory in the sense that it really makes this altruistic viewpoint the central component of the leadership process. And it really provides a different impact on terms of how we look at influence. So a lot of times we think of influence as control, but really servant leadership is kind of breaking those barriers and, sharing control with the followers and putting control into a different light. Um, and as it says here in the slide, servant leadership is not a panacea in the sense that it's may not be effective when subordinates are not open to it. So it's really important, like we were saying, is that you have to have followers that are willing to be guided and empowered and supported by the followers. And one great thing about this too is it's been measured and tested multiple times. The SLQ has been pretty prevalent in organizations to this day. There are a lot of different criticisms of this, and whether you agree with them or not, the name kind of appears contradictory. Servant leadership may be seen as kind of whimsical or not really leadership at all. I personally disagree with it. I think it's a great tandem to work with a lot of the leadership theories that we've talked about already. And there really isn't a common definition. And I personally think that's a good thing, because it's constantly evolving the way that we think about service to our followers as our society evolves. Think about how maybe serving our followers is going to change here just because of the response to this coronavirus that we're currently facing. The way that we work, we're going to be working probably at further distances for quite some time. And that may constantly change how we look at organizations in the future, to where organizations are very important, but we may have to be doing a lot of our work from afar just for this health and safety of others. So another criticism is really there's a prescriptive overtone that suggests that good leaders put others first, which kind of conflicts with some of the other things we've talked about, like directing, concern is production, and so on. But really, it's not that. Putting other first is a great supplement to any of the theories that we've talked about. And there's a lot of research out there that shows that being a good servant leader actually has a higher impact on production than other types of leadership modalities. So, this can really be applied at all different levels of management and all types of organizations, and it's growing. It's a very hot phrase in the leadership industry right now, and it's not going to be going anywhere. As we understand the importance of serving our followers more and more, it's only going to become more relevant in organizations. But this also kind of ties into some of the HR practices that I like to talk about in class, where organizations really need to be careful how they select their employees to make sure that they're interested in building these long-term relationships with their followers. And they're also really ethical, have a good moral compass to guide them in making these decisions and working with their followers and being a true servant. So that really is the gist of servant leadership. Like I said, it's a pretty short theory, and it's a really good supplement to a lot of the other theories we talked about. If you have any questions, let me know, though. This is a really great theory, something I encourage you to look into more and check out some of the supplemental videos by Robert Greenleaf. And there's also some TED Talks that I posted on eCampus for you to take a look at as well. Have a great day, everybody.